In this video, we will talk about the human relations approach. This video is based on Educational Administration, Concepts and Practices by Linenberg and Ornstein, 2011, published by Cengage Learning. So we will talk about the Hawthorne studies and their contribution to the human relations approach. We will talk about other contributors to the approach. We will discuss major assumptions of this approach and the criticisms. So the human relations approach really is considered to have begun with the so-called Hawthorne studies, which were conducted at the Hawthorne plant of Western Electric by Elton Mayo and his colleagues during 6 years between 1927 and 1933. And this was a huge study. It involved several experiments, and during these years, about more than 21,000 employees were interviewed. So you could consider this an enormous mixed method study. Okay, so the goal of the studies was to find out really what could improve productivity, right? And really there were a lot of assumptions and expectations and hypotheses, but why the studies influenced organizational theory so much, and actually a lot of our thinking until nowadays, is because the results were really unexpected, right? So let's look at this one of these experiments called relay assembly test room experiment, right? It was conducted, so the participants were females, and they were randomly divided into two groups. So the treatment group and the control group had the same conditions overall, right? So all the parameters were the same, except so the treatment was the variation in the lighting. Okay, so originally they wanted to see do people work better, or are they more productive if lighting is brighter, or is it when the bright lighting is dimmed, right? So the control group was in the same conditions, but they received no variation in lighting, right? So the result was really unexpected. Productivity in both groups was similar, and in fact, in the treatment group where the researchers, varied lighting, productivity got better as conditions got worse. As far as I remember, they tried other things like after they saw that lighting has no effect and actually worse lighting is better, leads to higher productivity. I think they tried something like length of work days, and with all the same results. Worse the conditions, the performance was better. So they were really surprised by these findings. Let's look at another experiment result here. Participants were male workers, right? And so they were divided into two groups randomly. The treatment group received higher pay, and the control group received just basic baseline payment, right? So the hypothesis was based on the classical organizational theory that the economic incentive of an opportunity to be paid higher would be sufficient to motivate people to work harder, right, and to be more productive. And what they found as a result was that most workers really ignored the incentive. That is, offering higher pay didn't lead to better productivity. And when the researchers started to look closely at what's going on, they noticed that um, when people work in groups, the group intends to informally establish some acceptable level of output, what they later called group norm. And those who try to perform beyond, like, or better or higher than the group norm, they were punished, like by even physically threatening, whereas those, to be fair, those who were trying to perform lower than the group norm, they were also punished, right? So this is really unexpected and kind of is in conflict with the assumption of the classical organizational theory about what motivates people to work, right? So group norm is a very powerful concept that emerged from this study. But you notice the pattern, right? So what was expected to motivate people to work, make them work harder, didn't work, and new things were found to be affecting performance. Okay, so once they realized that things are not actually going on as they hypothesized, the researchers conducted interviews, and they conducted more than 21,000 of them, right? So the main conclusion of those interviews was that there is a human social element operating in a workplace, and higher productivity is really a result of group dynamics and effective management, but not employer demands or physical factors. Okay, this was a real breakthrough, a real discovery at that time, right? I bet even nowadays, some of you would be surprised, yeah. So if you, as an employer, demand or improve or worsen physical factors, not necessarily that will affect productivity. Okay, so overall, we learned from the studies that productivity is related to morale, feeling of belonging, and effective management. And moreover, this qualitative aspect of this research allowed to actually pinpoint the components of effective management, such as motivating, leading, participative decision making, effective communications. All those things were conceptualized. Another thing I wanted to say here related to the Hawthorne studies is that, um, the researchers concluded that in the light bulb experiment, remember when, despite the level of lighting, the productivity was actually improving, no matter how worse the lighting became, right? So the conclusion was that the test group began to be noticed and felt important. So no matter how, whenever the lights changed, they actually made up by extra hard work, right? So the conclusion is that the core of the idea is that when people are noticed and when they feel important, uh, and that happens when they are observed, right, by someone they care about, um, they perform better. They perform differently than usual. And this is a very powerful concept called the Hawthorne effect. And as researchers in general, not just students of organizational theory, you should know this concept. So when you go to school, to university, to the field, right, and when you make observations, people behave differently. That's something you should know. And when designing your studies, you should really address the possible Hawthorne effect of your research, and come up with ways to make sure that your study is internally valid, and that your observation and people's adjustment of their behavior in response to your observation does not threaten the validity of your findings. Okay, let's move on. There were many other contributors to the human relations approach, and let's have a look at some of them. So Kurt, Kurt Lewin, he is famous for his work on democratic and authoritarian groups. His main conclusion was that democratic groups are more productive than authoritarian groups. I think it's a very interesting finding. Um, in general, the modern day organizational approaches to change through group dynamics, things like team buildings, Alcoholics Anonymous, and other things, and action research approaches to organizational development, they are all based on this guy's work. Okay. And the next contributor is Carl Rogers. He's famous for developing a procedure for industrial counseling, which can be actually implemented in many other contexts. And he was the first one to formulate assumptions for client-centered therapy. Okay. Next guy, Jacob Moreno, is famous for developing a sociometric technique. He developed a way to measure and to study how people develop, selective affinities for other people. In other words, he proposed a way to measure how people like other people. Why we like certain people at work, why we don't like others, why we like some of them more or less. Quite exciting. Um, White and Homans are famous for their field work. Their work is really not just laboratory experiments, but real life situations. They focus mostly on the restaurant industry, and they are famous for their work on intergroup conflict, status within groups, workflow, and they were able to determine that people's likings or dislikings of other people depend on age, gender, and outside interests. Yeah, so interesting series of studies. All right, so there are seven major assumptions of the human relations approach. Okay, the first assumption is that employees are motivated by social and psychological needs, and by economic incentives, right? Not only by economic incentives, but by the social and psychological needs also. The second assumption is that these needs are more important for productivity than physical conditions of the workplace. Uh, you know, um, the third assumption is that individuals' perceptions, beliefs, motivations, cognition, responses to frustration, values, and other things may affect behavior in the work setting. The next assumption, number four, is that in all types of organizations, people develop informal social structures, social organizations, and those could work along um, and help or actually hinder management, yeah, in the formal organization. The fifth assumption is that informal social groups within the workplace create and enforce their own norms and codes of behavior. The sixth assumption is that employees have higher morale and work harder under supportive management. And furthermore, higher morale means higher productivity. Uh, Finally, the last seventh assumption is that communication, power, influence, authority, motivation, and manipulation are all important relationship in organizations, right? You can see how the human relations approach advanced our understanding. The seven very powerful assumptions, they are a huge step forward from the classical organizational theory, but nevertheless, there were criticisms of the human relations approach, right? So the main criticism was that just no matter how this approach advanced our understanding, it still offers an incomplete representation of what's going on in the workplace, right? We still did not fully understand. We still this approach doesn't fully represent workers, employees in the work setting, right? Um, Another criticism is that often, human relations approach is contradicting the classical organizational theory, right? So if two things are contradicting, either one of them is right and the other is wrong, or perhaps both of them are wrong, right? So all of these criticisms led to the development of the behavioral science approach, which is going to be the subject of our following video. Thanks for watching.